I'm listening to this podcast called the Increments Podcast. These fellows are critical rationalists, I think. They're discussing meta-rationality, this philosophy or epistemology or who knows what, by a fellow called David Chapman. So I just want to say a few things about both. I'm here on AirChat talking about the Increments Podcast, which itself is talking about a podcast, Do Explain, a series on that podcast, where they're discussing a guy called David Chapman. And on the Do Explain podcast with Chris Lovkin, he interviewed Luli Tennant and Jake Orthwein, the latter of whom is a fan of the work of David Chapman. David Chapman claims to have criticisms of critical rationalism, sometimes. Other times he says he just doesn't understand critical rationalism. He doesn't know what Deutsch and Popper are getting to. He'd be a fellow to completely ignore, if not for the attention he's getting. I'm concerned I played a role in this at some point. The attention, undeserved, I would say. Okay, so why? Why am I saying this? So doing a quick search on Twitter of my interactions with this so-called philosophy called meaningness, and this fellow called David Chapman. This is 2016, I think, I'm just casual. But so it's been about, casual search, it's been about a decade since I first encountered this. And the only reason I took an interest in it was I thought, okay, is anyone seriously trying to defend, from a rational kind of perspective, postmodernism? Anyone modern? And sure enough, on Twitter, I eventually found someone, this David Chapman fellow, who was writing what I regarded as something approaching nonsense in the postmodern sense. So you couldn't make head nor tail of it. He said there was something deep here. A lot of people said there was something deep here, but I basically ignored it. And then some intelligent people took up the mantle. But instead of critiquing the ideas there on the basis that they didn't try and make themselves clear. So I would say Chapman suffers from the fatal flaw. He's not striving for clarity. He's striving to obfuscate. He's striving to make problems where there are no problems. I've written a whole series on this. I've recorded podcasts on this. I find it all nonsense. The reason it's coming up now is because this new podcast, Increments, is now also discussing it. He just gets more and more attention, and I feel as though I'm responsible, in some sense, because of all that time ago, just kind of bringing up his work and then dismissing it as, here's an example of postmodernism in the modern age. There's a lot of it going around at the moment. There's a Marxist kind of postmodernism in the modern gender war stuff. Okay, but is there any other similar kinds to this, where people are not trying to make sense of the English language and make sense of our circumstance, but rather throw in shade when you could be casting light? And I would say this Chapman fellow in Meaningness is doing exactly that. They have this entire thing called nebulosity, for example. But never mind all that. Chapman, meaningness, so it's called, nebulosity. All of this stuff, I have one question that continues to go unanswered. In any of these interviews that are done about his work, he seems to rarely talk about it, in anything you read about his work. And that simple question is, as Popper would ask, what problem are you trying to solve? That's it. What problem does this nebulosity stuff solve? Popper's critical rationalism exists precisely in order to solve a whole bunch of problems that people were asking, sensible questions about how science works, how mathematics works, how is knowledge generated, how did we get from Galileo to Newton to Einstein to quantum theory to Deutsch? How does that process work? Induction didn't solve it. None of the pre-existing ways of approaching epistemology solved that question until Popper came along and said, hey, this is what we're doing. We're asking questions, we're answering them by a process of identifying errors, correcting errors. That's it. Okay, so what does nebulosity add to this? There is nothing anywhere in the writings of Chapman or in the interviews where they ever explain what problem they're solving. All they're doing is what Wittgenstein did. All they're doing is what the postmodernists did. All they're doing is throwing shade on solutions and just saying, I don't understand how this is a solution. I don't understand Popperian epistemology. Therefore, endorse my nonsense, my lack of clarity. This is what the postmodernists have always done. They don't like the fact that some people are doing science, making progress, actually providing you with solutions. And so what they say is, no, I'm a smart person. I'm not doing science, but hey, science doesn't get to reality. It doesn't get to the final answer. There is no final answer. Here's my philosophy that explains all of that nonsense. That's not the way any of this works. Science produces solutions. How do we know? Because it works. Why do we care about that? Well, that's where the philosophy comes in. That's where Popper comes in. That's where Deutsch comes in. What Chapman does in the modern versions of postmodernism is to say, oh, no, the postmodernists were right. You never get to the final truth. But Popper never said you're going to get to the final truth. Critical rationalism isn't about that. And you know what? When you try and enter into a reasonable discussion with these people, what do? They say, I'm not doing philosophy. If you're going to debate with me about the merits of my new epistemology called meaningness, you're missing the point because I'm not doing philosophy, I'm doing something else. Well, okay, I can accept that. But stop then also saying that science doesn't get to the truth or Popper made mistakes, because then you are engaging in a critical discussion. You can't have it both ways. If you're not doing philosophy, then don't engage with philosophical ideas, don't make strong claims, but they do that. They want it both ways. My simple response to all of this is they're just cult leaders. They're trying to start a new religion, and they don't like the fact that there are some people out here, me and Deutsch among others, who say of those kind of movements, you're not solving any problems, you're just making things worse. So here's my own work on this, a link to a lengthy blog post in that blog post, linked to a lengthy sort of podcast. I just made lengthy audio comments on this stuff. And as I say, throughout my writings and throughout my speech on this before, there is zero here that contributes to the solving of any problems, that helps people in any way. As Chapman himself, the author of all of this stuff, wrote back in 2020 in a tweet that I quote, and I'll quote it again here now, quote, "I am not doing philosophy," end quote. So, very well. Then how do you go about critiquing someone who says, in a philosophical discussion, they're not doing philosophy? Because then you get to the person who says he's explaining all this stuff, this Jake Orthwein fellow, this lovely guy, great, okay. But after the author of all of this says he's not doing philosophy explicitly, Jake, who is to Chapman, as I suppose I am to Deutsch in some sense, this Orthwein fellow has said, nebulosity, quote, "Nebulosity isn't just about vagueness or uncertainty, it's about reality. The claim is that reality is not inherently divided into definite objects, categories, properties, and relationships. This means even propositions can't be definitely true or false about it," end quote. Okay. These two claims about what nebulosity is strictly contradict each other. On the one hand, Chapman, the author of this idea, says it is not philosophy, and on the other hand, Orthwein says, no, this nebulosity stuff is about reality. So, can we engage with this idea, critically or not? On the one hand, we've got the claim it's about reality. Okay, well, let's talk about reality then. And on the other, no, you can't critique me because I'm not doing philosophy. You're misunderstanding me. This is all nonsense. What Orthwein says there in the remainder of his tweet is nothing that contradicts anything that Deutsch, Popper, myself, critical rationalism, rational philosophy more broadly, tends to say. In other words, Chapman's not adding anything here. When Orthwein says, quote, "The claim is that reality is not inherently divided into definite objects, categories, properties, and relationships," end quote, agreed. Fine. So again, what's Chapman adding that's new? Let's go on. He even then goes on to say, quote, "This means even propositions can't be definitely true or false about it," end quote. True on the one hand. You can't say anything absolutely true about reality. That's the claim of Popper. Chapman isn't improving Popper here. He's just restating the case, if that's what's going on here. Propositions can be definitely true or false, but not true or false about reality. This gets into the technicals. What I'm saying here is that Orthwein isn't contradicting Popper. Chapman isn't contradicting Popper. Or insofar as they are, Chapman retreats to the position that he's not doing philosophy anyway, so you can't critique him. Why would I be animated about any of this? I feel bad for having brought him up a decade ago. Because from what I said, it then seems to have gone through the critical rationalist community and people taking this all very seriously, as if there's something substantive here. But there isn't. And my point in bringing it up in the first place was just to dismiss it as an example. It's just an example. There are many examples out there in the world I could have picked where I could say, look, there are modern day philosophers and cult leaders and movements that are not making sense. They're producing nonsense. It doesn't help to solve any problems. It confuses people. Postmodernists and Marxists have been around for a long time, trying to gain followers by obfuscating, throwing shade, and not enlightening people, but doing the opposite. That's all I was saying. But now, even though these people are critiquing the work of Chapman on these podcasts, I feel as if too much airtime. Here I am adding to it again. I should probably just shut up about it. All I want to say is postmodernism as a movement is evil, defunct, evil in the technical sense, evil in the sense that it is exacerbating problems, not improving them. Chapman is in this lineage, his work. I'm not saying he's evil, I'm saying he's confused, but his ideology leads like a straight line into nonsense, which leads to evil. I apologise for saying that, but that's just a fact. So there's Orthwein's tweet that I'm responding to, which I say contradicts what Chapman himself has said in tweets, namely he's not doing what Orthwein claims he's doing. Chapman says he's not doing philosophy. Chapman says he's not talking about reality. Orthwein says he is. The claim that reality is not inherently divided into definite objects, etc., propositions can't be definitely true or false about reality, none of that contradicts anything that Deutsch and Popper say. In other words, they're not identifying a problem with anything in critical rationalism or in Popper Deutsch. Nothing of the sort. They're doing something different. And as I say in my response to this, insofar as they're not doing philosophy and they're doing something more like what Buddhism at times claims it's doing, which is not philosophy but self-help of a kind, that's fine. But stick to that. Stick to saying what we're about is a kind of internal, subjective way of thinking about minds that might help you when you're going through a depressing time, you're confused, whatever. Okay, more power to people who do that insofar as people find help, but don't then go on to say that you're actually talking about reality, you're actually talking about cups and objects and all this sort of nonsense. When we do philosophy is the queen of the sciences. It's there to try and help you solve problems in science and mathematics and reason more broadly. That's what it exists for. The self-help stuff is secondary to all of that.